Let me begin the presentation. Let me briefly talk about my background, academic background, from my previous current position at the TOBB University for the last 15 years. I was academic at Turkish Military Academy. I served a decade at Turkish Military Academy. And also before that, a decade I served in Turkish military, which made me to have observations about the activities in Turkish military individually. And also, actually, these individual observations made me to conduct research on this specific subject because especially during my academic position at Turkish Military Academy, there were lots of foreigner students. We used to call them guest students at Turkish Military Academy, not only from Balkans, but also from Central Asia, including Korea. So it made me think about that issue on the first place because it was a huge amount of people. And during my service also, since I was logistical officer, so I also had witnessed lots of foreign aids to the foreign countries, lots of countries from Turkish military. And going back to 2020, during the second war between, short one, between Armenia and Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh, there were lots of discussions whether the Turkish support to Azerbaijan from UAV with UAVs and also Turkish generals leaded the war and made the Azerbaijan be victorious side of that war. So I stood against that idea. So because I thought it was so superficial comment, assessments on the issue, that would be something deeper. So I published an op-ed at Inside Turkey from German Marshall Foundation, GMF in DC. So it had lots of concern. And the main point of that op-ed was there's an overlooked role of Turkey or Turkey. They changed it from Turkey to Turkey. So that I say Turkey, it means not chicken. Okay, it's the country. So the overlooked of Turkey's position in second Nagorno-Karabakh war was Turkish army building process efforts for Azerbaijan. So it made me think about that way. So I claimed it was not the war of Turkey supported Azerbaijan. It was the war between built army by Turkey at NATO standards versus leftover of Red Army. Armenia opted for leftovers of Red Army. So it was quite obsolete for the current modern warfare, but Azerbaijan did a lot of work, so it changed everything. So it was the starting point of my research question for this article, which was published at Southeast European and Black Sea Studies Journal with my Ph.D. student, Elif Merve Dumankaya. Thanks to her, I need to echo her name here. So, and then our research question emerged from that understanding. How many bilateral military cooperation agreements Turkey had done throughout the period? To do that, this is, sorry, I need to be oriented to the device. So this is introduction, and first of all, I will talk about the general framework of Turkish foreign policy for the last 3 decades, and then I will touch upon my research design and methodology, and then I will analyze the database we have come up with during the research. So at this point, the puzzle of this presentation is Turkey's influence on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia brought significant attention to its military cooperation and assistance, advanced capabilities of Turkey's UAVs and strategic guidance provided by Turkish military consultants to Azerbaijan military. So, however, the literature lacks a general framework of Turkey composed various bilateral military cooperation. So, my claim from 1990, roughly, by the time the Cold War was over, from that time onwards, Turkey has been establishing bilateral relations, which was the groundwork was established during the 1990s through the NATO partnership policies, and then Turkey kept this path, NATO partnership policies, and also built a military cooperation network through bilateral relations. So, as you can see, our research has been excluding use of force deployments, multilateral cooperation agreements, such as NATO and some others, and also peace support operations. It is only limited to bilateral military agreements. First, and the second, during the research, we exclude the performances of assessment of the agreements. We just created normative database for this issue. In total, Turkey has signed with 84. Sorry,
what do you mean normative?
Normative base means agreements from the official Gazette. We collected all these agreements and the rules. But we also give some examples, some performance, but we are not grading the performance of all these agreements. We will give the only framework of it. So it is a kind of first step of this research because it is first of its kind. So far nobody has constructed or established such database and such photo of the Turkish military cooperation. So in future, we assume in near future, the follow-up research will empower that perspective. So let's begin with the general framework of Turkish foreign policy for the last 3 decades, 3.5 decades. During the introduction, Sharat talked about Turkey would be major power. Actually, in academic literature, Turkish perspective sometimes humble for this issue. So if roughly I need to describe Turkish foreign policy, for 1990s, the 1990s, Turkey was described as traditional middle power. During the first decade of the 21st century, Turkey was described itself as rising middle power. And on the second decade of the 20th century, between 2010 and 2020, Turkey was focusing on strategic autonomy. And from 2020 onwards, it is quite stabilized middle power in Turkish foreign policy for describing Turkey instead of strategic autonomy. And also, this article puts the position Turkey as a pivotal role, not an autonomous or something like that, middle power, and has a huge pivotal role in the region. So, how did it begin? Actually, if you go back to the Turkish history, it's a very huge and long history of Turks have throughout the history, and very victorious and military tradition really matters, especially during the Ottoman Empire and legendary Janissaries. They did a lot of things, and also they were quite successful. But after the Enlightenment in the Europe, after the Middle Age, after the Enlightenment and the product of the Industrial Revolution, Turks realized that their military was not so victorious, and they need to reshape because after the 17th century they were they became behind the Europe rivals, its rivals. So by the end of 18th century, Turkey began Turkey became a military aid recipient from various nations. And throughout this period, as you might know, militaries are capable of replicating the good lessons, good samples. So during the after the French Revolution, 1789 and 1798, Turkey opted for French école. So actually it was lasted very short period of time because of the fact that Napoleon did a campaign against Egypt. Formerly during that time it was Ottoman soil, so it was last than a decade the French école in Turkish understanding. But during those years, this new contemporary military tradition of French paved a way Turkish military begin its reform in accordance with the let's say modern age, industrial age. But later, in the beginning of the second quarter of the 19th century, Turks with the Mahmud II. I mean, for the French école, I would echo the name of Selim III. And for the second quarter of the 19th century, Mahmud II opted for Prussian école and later German école as a military recipient, military aid recipient. Actually, Prussian model for a long time, it was a model for Turkish military until the end of the Great War, World War I. Very interesting story. In early 1830s, Moltke, Hermann von Moltke, was a young officer. He came to Turkey as a military advisor. Later, during the last quarter of the 19th century, he was the victorious General Marshal of the new established unified Germany. So I would say Germans or Prussians did care about Turkish military transformation, but it is ended after the defeat of the Great War, and then Turkey isolated itself during that period because it was a kind of catching up the industrial revolution. But Turkey kept its revolution in military affairs for its école after the Second World War. Soon after the Second World War, Stalin made claims against Turkish borders and Turkish straits, and also confinement policy of the United States made them emerge one point, Turkey and America. And also from that time until the end of the Cold War, Turkey was one of the biggest military aid recipient from the United States of America. It created, I mean, by the end of the 1989, by the end of the Cold War, Turkey was the biggest, second biggest army military of the NATO. So it had already reached all NATO standards. Actually, it was quite advanced military during the new period of post-Cold War era. So from that time onwards, Turkey changed its role as a military support provider. So how did it happen? Actually, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, there were lots of Eastern European countries, states, and also Central Asian states, which they wanted to be in contact with NATO. And NATO has had an interest to make them engage to the NATO and the West. Actually, it is also start of the Turkey's military provider role. So in our research, we collected data set. The data set includes beginning from 1990 until the end of 2023. During the first stage, we collected data from the official Gazeta. And then after collecting data, we refined the data and applied to the Ministry of Defense. and then we have come up with two categories of agreements. One is the first one is framework agreements. The second one kind of agreements is follow-up agreements. So framework agreements, its brand name is Framework Agreement for Military Affairs. For follow-up agreements, its brand name is Agreement for Military Training and Cooperation. It is all about the content. Sometimes the agreement titles might change because of it is not the product of the defined strategy, but at the end we track the strategy and we have come up the Turkish strategy for military cooperation network, I would say. And also framework agreements necessarily means that with that specific state, Turkey has an engagement, military cooperation agreement. Engagement. And follow-up agreement means we proceed, we develop the relations and we move beyond the first step, and it is a kind of performance of the relations. So this is the, let me put it in that way, this is the general diagram of Turkish bilateral military cooperation network through the years. The line beginning from 0 to above the 140, which 147, it is the accumulation of the agreements. And also the light red describes framework agreements. Dark red is about the follow-up agreements that I mentioned. So in total, we have 147 agreements with different 84 states. And this data set excludes multilateral agreements. These are, all of them are bilateral agreements. So what Turkey did, actually, this is the map of NATO partnership map all around the world. There are different NATO partnership programs. First is Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. The second, NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue. South Hub. Partners across the globe. There are suspended partnerships, Afghanistan and Russia, as you can see, as you can understand, and also including the Gulf nations. Istanbul Cooperation Initiative is another initiative. And if we look at NATO map and move to the Turkish bilateral military relations network, actually it shows the capacity. All in all, I mean, excluding the South America, that one has a different characteristic from the others. But apart from that one, Turkey's bilateral military relation network is under the aligned with the transatlantic interests. Turkey has been doing good for it. So that's why I described at the beginning Turkey's role as not only as a middle power, but also as a pivotal role Turkey has been doing. So it was necessary for Turkey because of the fact that after the Cold War, there was an uncertainty. There were lots of conflicts around Turkey, as well as frozen conflicts. So it was creating lots of security concern. So the usage of Turkish military through the agreements and also bilateral relations, it has been producing security for Turkey itself, in addition to peace enforcement deployments and also peace support deployments. Apart from that one, I did publish an article about Turkish military peacekeeping forces, which is accessible, openly accessible database. Türkiye Barış Koruma Veri Tabanı, TOBB, Turkish Peacekeeping database. It is accessible. I think missing point is we need another database, Turkish military enforcement deployments, which is necessary. It could be complementary in the future for Turkish military role, pivotal role in the region. So during the database and my analysis, I will talk about different regions and different motivations. So we put them 5 clusters: the European states, the Caucasia and Central Asia, the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf states, African states, and various bilateral military cooperations. We have 5 clusters to analyze our military cooperation network database. So if we look generally, check the military cooperation distribution for the regions, we see Africa. We will talk about that later. America is limited. Asia, Europe. So you can see the distribution of the agreements. So if we take into account decades, 10-year portions of these agreements, as you can see, during the 1990s, the European and also Central Asian states' bilateral relations dominate. For the first decade of the 21st century, Asian states are dominating, including the Middle East. And also for the 2010 onwards, African states have been dominating the agreements, dominating the distribution of the database, which is connected to the Turkish foreign policy. During the 1990s, Turkey was a traditional middle power, taking the role of the NATO enlargement and taking the responsibility. And later, during the first decade, Turkey it was a period of new Ottomanism discussions at the AKP ruling party in Turkey. There were lots of annoying in the region, annoying discourses for especially strategic debt of the former Minister of Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, Davutoğlu, Ahmet Davutoğlu. His approach resulted in neo-Ottomanism. So we see that approach on the second decade. For the third decade, it was a kind of period for looking for strategic autonomy, and also Turkey turned its face to Africa, which really important for the assessment. Let's begin with clusters. As I mentioned before, these clusters, European states, Caucasus, and Central Asia, and goes like that. Let's check in that perspective order. So in European states, as you can see, in middle of 1990s really mattered. First of all, NATO's Partnership for Peace Training Center was established in Ankara, and Turkey trained lots of former Soviet republics and former Warsaw Pact states militaries in Ankara. It was really important. Let me put another good story about that issue. By the time Turkey became sponsor of Azerbaijan to train its military in accordance with the NATO standards, Greece opted for Armenia, and also Greece became sponsor of Armenia to train its military during the post-Soviet period. But since the lack of capacity, it wouldn't last than 2 years. So that attempt interrupted in the way. And even during that period, Turkish Partnership for Peace Center hosted Armenian officers to train at NATO standards. So it was open to all nations. So I'm putting to your attention because of the fact that my puzzle was beginning with Armenia and Azerbaijan war, but it wasn't just a nationalist approach. It was the differentiation of the being sponsorship and having a capacity. Thanks to the Turkish military's capacity, paved the way to deliver the results. So for European states, to say the short and save the time, not too long, I would say most of them became NATO members. All these states. I mean, in the early 1990s, Turkey did sign bilateral military agreements with them, with the other NATO member states. They did as well. Turkey supported them a lot. And by the time we reached 2009, with the membership of Albania, most of these states became member of NATO. So mission accomplished on the one hand. But on the other hand, that European experience supporting bilaterally European Eastern states militaries, it created a base for Turkey, a groundwork for Turkey to train other militaries in the following years. So it is a kind of fundamentals of Turkish military provider role. So for Caucasia and Central Asia, former Soviet republics, beginning from Georgia, Azerbaijan, even including Armenia, although we do not have bilateral military agreement, and other Turkic states, as you see in 1990s, we did a lot. So there is a specific example for this region. Actually, for each continent, Turkey has one leading role model for the rest of the region. For Asia or Central Asia, Azerbaijan is the leading state. For Gulf states and the Middle East, Qatar is the leading one. And also for Africa, Somalia is the leading one. They are role model. They have a capacity for being a role model to the rest of the continent. So for Azerbaijan, it is just like Turkey accumulated from Prussia through the centuries. Turkey has been doing the same to Azerbaijan for the army building process. Turkey even founded military academy not only in Azerbaijan but also in Georgia. So they raised their let's say officers, especially for Azerbaijan. Now we reached the level we can perform combined military exercises, including Navy, Air Force, and Land Forces, Azerbaijan and Turkey at the brigade level and above. So it is a huge coordination capacity. I would say Azerbaijan still has a long way to reach the NATO standards, but it is not incomparable to back to 1990s. It was terrible in the early 1990s. Bribe was something, lots of privileges existing in Azerbaijan. It was a military. But later, after the 3.5 decades, it has a capacity to be a proper military. Still, they have a long way, but they are doing great job. So it is same for Georgia, and Turkey care about Georgian security a lot because it is about the Turkey's security as well. And also Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. These are the other states Turkey has been getting along with. And also we have a Turkic organization of Turkic states, which has a promising international organization. These bilateral military relations creating understanding, cultural, political and security understanding with these nations. For Arabian Peninsula, as you see, first case of the 21st century mainly is the issue for Arabian Peninsula. But as I mentioned, because of the hot conflicts in the region, as well as concerns of the neo-Ottomanism policy, didn't make Turkey deliver its potential bilateral military relations, but it has established a base for future and created a capacity But apart from all of them, Qatar is the leading sample in this region for bilateral relations. And later, Turkey opened a military base in Qatar, and they have strategic dialogue mechanisms between Qatar and Turkey, including military issues. And it has a huge
You said
capacity.
military base?
Yes, military base. Turkish military base existing in Qatar.
Autonomous military base?
Yes, autonomous
Never
military.
heard of that.
Yeah. In Doha. And also for African continent, actually it really takes very interesting notice for me because Turkey first 1998, Turkey declared its action plan for opening up to Africa by Minister of Foreign Affairs. Later in 2008, Turkey became strategic partner of African Union. So after that time onwards, Turkey's interest to Africa increased. Of course, Turkey is a developing country and also wants to break the middle income trap. So there are two options for that one. One is high technology products. The other is defense industry. I think Turkey has been opted for defense industry and sell products from the defense industry for overcoming the middle income tax. So Africa was playing very important role for that one. But also compared to other NATO member states, lack of colonial past of Turkey creates very unique position for Turkey in future. As you might know, NATO cares about Africa. NATO South policy is really important for NATO. Having stated that one, I would like to put the example of Turkey's role in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, Turkey was the actor, only Muslim country, Muslim populated country in NATO, prevented to accept NATO operation in Afghanistan was crusade. Actually, Turkey played very important role for eliminating that misunderstanding for Afghanistan operation and leaded a couple of times to Afghanistan mission, not only for NATO, but also for the all around the world. So Turkey's unique position in Africa is similar in Afghanistan, could be similar in Africa. Lack of colonial past of Turkey for the future could be a leverage for NATO policies, implementing NATO policy, transatlantic policies in Africa. It creates a unique position. So far, Turkey has engaged by the end of 2023, engaged with 33 different nations, bilateral military agreements, which creates a robust base for the future policies. And for Africa, the leading role and role model for the rest of the Africa, although it is not tranquil for the time being, Somalia. Somalia opened a military base again in Somalia. Turkey has a military base in Somalia, and also military training and education facility in Somalia. Turkey has been training militaries in Africa, and also specifically in Somalia, it has a military base for military aid, supporting the army building process of Somalia. If Somalia can reach a peaceful environment, which is a big achievement, which could be a big achievement, that could be very important role model for the rest of Africa and could be very important leverage for NATO policies in Africa. I did conduct research on behalf of NATO Transformation HQ, located here in Norfolk. The title of the research was what Africa demands from NATO. So interestingly, they don't demand anything connected to the colonialism, and also current experience from the Russia and China. Neo-colonialism is also allergic for African nations. Actually, based on that research, I would say, I would dare to say, Turkey has a huge capacity to play for to implement transatlantic relations, transatlantic interests in Africa. And also we have Turkey has various bilateral military cooperation agreements. Going back to the in order of alphabet, Afghanistan. Actually, we have contemporary agreements in Afghanistan. Turkey-Afghanistan relations going back to military aid relations going back to the late 19th century. From late 19th century onwards, Turkey has been supporting Afghanistan with lots of interruptions because of the political issues. But if you talk to the Afghani military and Afghani military Dari language, there are lots of Turkish military words because of these effects. Australia, Bangladesh, Brazil, Indonesia, Sweden used to be a non-NATO member, later they became. Republic of Korea. These are the nations with individual relations. Especially Turkey has very specific relations, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also Korea, coming from the Korean War, and also Pakistan because of their religious and cultural connections with Turkey, and the others are more or less related to the industrial defense industry and exporting the goods. So these are the issues. I'm just checking the. I think I need to finish in a couple of minutes. If I need to come to the conclusion and key takeaways for my research and moving to the question and comment session. First of all, this pattern of Turkish military cooperation network pattern began back 1990, not to the current ruling party's policies. Actually, it is beyond that one. It is unnamed policy. So far, it wasn't named by anyone. We have a saying, form the caravan on the way in Turkish. Actually, we formed that caravan on the way. So actually the consistency of the bilateral relations of Turkey establishing bilateral relations, the consistent policies created a huge network. Actually, it is the leading the first in the world. There's a scholar, I think he's at Santa Cruz, who's dealing with military bilateral relations. He also claimed that it is the #1 Turkish bilateral military cooperation network is leading even beyond the United States. And it has a huge capacity and huge examples in Balkans and also in Europe, which resulted in very constructive and secure ways. So it also samples in Caucasia. It is a big framework on also a promising approach for Africa. I would say Turkey would, there's a cliche in Turkey for Africa opening. Turkish Airlines fly every corners of Africa. I think after that article, I would say it is not only Turkish Airlines, but also Turkish bilateral military relations and also other flying zones, so to say, for Africa. So it will establish. It is important because we need to go back Turkish modernization, late 19th century, late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Turkish military played a role, an engine role for the rest of the society. It was the engine for the modernization of Turkish society, Turkish community, just for making catch the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And Turkish military played very important role. And you know what you learned, you teach what you learned. And Turkey was taught to use military modernization could be locomotive or engine for the society, for state building process. Actually, especially for Africa, the way Turkey learned, the way Turkey trained, and also it would be very important because, as you know, militaries are organizations. It needs a very huge organization capacity. If you establish an organizational capacity, you can implement it to other fields. So it is also promising approach. For the future research, one can easily conduct research on for the period military enforcement deployments of Turkey, for taking into account other dimension of Turkish military on one hand. On the other hand, specifically, it is worth to deal with the performances of the role models, namely Azerbaijan, Qatar, and Somalia in deep research, and also the patterns, the performances of the follow-up agreements. Also, it is worth to deal with this issue. Let me stop here, Sharat. Thank you very much for your patience.
No, thank you, Haldun. That was quite a tour de force of going through of Turkish military cooperation agreements as such an important mechanism of its foreign policy strategies, and you went through history and different case studies. So I do have a whole bunch of questions, as you saw, took a bunch of notes. But let me open it up to.
So you can save the Q&A section.
No. This was.
It is quite professional moderation.
This was quite a bit, actually. But let me just open it up to Q&A and discussions and comments. And I see our colleague, Dr. Cohn.
Thank you.
Please.
There was something which I thought was a little, at least from terminological point of view, a little needs explanation. I had a feeling that you put together things which normally we put them as two different baskets. That is to say, military and defense / industrial relations, which are by the military industries, by the civilian military industries, you put them together as military. Most of the time when we refer to that, the business and the relationship between the company, the defense companies to other countries, it's separate from military to military cooperation. So am I right that you put together the issue of the civilian military defense sale purchases and the like, and military to military training and the like? So that's one. And I think the motivations and the economics and the dynamics of those things are usually not at the same. I wouldn't put it in the same basket. So that's one issue. The other thing, which makes me smile, you hardly say Ottoman, and you put together as Turkish and Ottoman history as one. I teach some classes about Middle East, and I talk a little bit about the Ottoman legacy and all that. I take the side that Ataturk was a great departure from the Ottoman in so many ways, and the outlook, and of course there is some element of continuity. So that's, but it was intriguing to me, the fact that you refer to it essentially as one in the same history, and I wonder why. Third issue, which I'm curious, and you said nothing about it, two related things, is the rise in the last 10 years of Turkey. By the way, in Hebrew, we say Turkiya. The rise of Turkey as a powerhouse in production of drones. And in that respect, its involvement, again, you didn't mention it, but in the conflict in Ukraine. I understand that now Ukrainians have become themselves a major powerhouse. In part, they started with manufacturing Turkish drones, and now they're doing a great deal of their own beyond that. But if you can say something about that. And lastly, the relation between Israel and Turkey are complex and convoluted, to say the least. But in the 90s, the Israeli military industry, particularly the aviation industry, were very much involved in huge project, hundreds of millions of dollars, in essentially overhauling and remanufacturing of the F-4, the Phantoms of the Turkish, giving it completely new aviations, new all kind of the avionics, exactly. So obviously things have changed, and as you know, there are talks today in Azerbaijan between Israel and Turkey, essentially promoted by President Trump, about finding some line of coexistence in Syria after Israel bombed the T4, the base in Syria. So I put you a lot of stuff. But I'm curious.
But I couldn't understand your third question. UAVs in Ukraine. Was it comment or any question?
You didn't say. I mean, I understand that Turkey has become a powerhouse in productions in manufacturing, production of drones. And it sold many of them to Ukraine. In the early stages of the Ukraine war, the Ukrainians were using primarily Turkish drones. Ukraine has advanced itself into that field very much. Today, it's according to Zelensky, it's the #1 producer of drones. But if you can say, you didn't mention at all Ukraine, if you can say a little bit about first how Turkey became such a strong drone power, and also its involvement and of course, as you know, initially Turkey, rather than Saudi Arabia, was trying to be the place to negotiate between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, by now it's Saudi Arabia who's doing that. So.
Okay, so let me put it in that way. Last two questions are not related to my research, but my knowledge. Okay, international security. But the first two questions are related to my research. So presentation. Let me begin with them and then move to others. So military, defense industry, and on actually, maybe I should have echoed because of the time limitation. I didn't talk about. Generally, all these agreements are titles, or the titles including the words, keywords: training, technical, and scientific cooperation in military field. So it covers training, technical assistance, scientific cooperation, and military field.
But between whom and whom?
Bilateral relations. Turkey with
No. But
84
between
nations.
the Turkish army and the local army, or between the...
That's a good question. All these agreements are ratified at Turkish Grand National Assembly, which means between the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, as well as the related ministries are interlocutors. So these are ratified. It is this research excluding protocols between the militaries and in defense industries, so on and so on. It is the state by state agreements. These, all of them are state agreements and ratified at the parliament. First of all. So
Just to be clear terminologically, for example, when Lockheed or McDonald or any major American company make contract with another country to sail, or Boeing to sail, you know, F-35, whatever, it's approved by the U.S. government, but essentially it's between the Ministry of Defense of that country and the company. Even though it's approved and there is also some papers at the level of the state to state, but it's different than the U.S. Army is providing assistance. So I wonder if you include, when you talk about those agreements, both the civilian defense organizations, which most of them are indeed civilians, and other countries, and you put it together in one basket or not?
No, I didn't put them in one basket. It utterly excludes the defense industry, firms, companies, so on. So it is all about the state institutions. Turkish military, in accordance with one of the
military
agreements,
means the Turkish army?
Army, Navy, Air Force, which means military. So terminologically speaking, it is in general military. It sometimes happens Air Force, sometimes Army, sometimes Navy, sometimes Coast Guard. So it depends. Depends on. So Turkish military gives a military assistance to other military, excluding the companies. But the side product, just like in McDonald's give toys to the children and make them be acquainted with the McDonald's. Later wanted to, as they grow up, they wanted to stop by to the McDonald's. Actually, if Turkish military trained them with the Turkish guns and they even give Turkish uniform, later when they trained, in future they would like to go for Turkish equipment by product of the Turkish industry. It is a side effect, yeah, I would say, in future, just like the Turkey. I mean, Turkish officers wanted to have equipment from America, US, not because of they trained in American. So I would say thank you for making clarification. I should have echoed at presentation because of time.
Because I thought, and obviously I was mistaken that you include.
No. It is not included. But it is a side effect for that one. So for Turkish Ottoman, that's a very good question. There's a big question and big discussion, and as a Middle expert, you would know much better than me, I do believe, because your lands, I mean, your ancestors' lands were peaceful for 1,000 years under the Turkish management, administration.
It was part of it.
Yeah, it was quite peaceful for 1,000 years. By the time Turks quit that, and then conflicts emerged. But apart from that one, we have two schools in Turkey, continuation or just not the continuation. So there are two schools. Apart from putting that discussions aside, we have institutions in Turkey. Some institutions emerged before the Turkish Republic, older than. For example, Selim III, end of the 18th century, he was the man who founded Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So for the establishment date for Minister of Foreign Affairs going back to the 1789 or 1780, something like that. It is older than Turkish
But it was
Republic.
under the Sultan.
Yeah, of course. But the institution was established in 1700s, and Turkish military was also established before the Turkish Republic. Since we are talking about Turkish military, putting these discussions aside, we can care about the continuity of the issue. That's why I'm taking into account continuity. I mean, Turkish Military Academy was founded, the academy which I was graduated, 1830. The military high school was founded 1846, older than Turkish Republic. So Republican period is the continuation of the Turkish Republic, Turkish state, Ottoman Turkish state. Or apart from all these discussions, the institution itself is older than Turkish Republic. So it gives let's say incentive to me, to discretion to me to take into account.
I'll tell you very frankly, which is interesting. I thought that and most Turkish scholars and others that I met, until the 90s, I mean, there was a strong effort to separate. And there is a feeling, there is a sense that in the time of Erdogan, there is more a sense of doing continuity. Erdogan looked at that, and a lot of Turkish historians kind of have a revisionist outlook. So because
it created concern in Middle East in the first decade of the 21st century because of the neo-Ottomanism. So it is it is so
because
disturbing.
in the past, most people make a very strong separation. Ataturk is something else.
Yeah.
I see a lot of parallels in that with Russia, Soviet Union, and Putin sort of having the nostalgia for Soviet times.
Definitely. And also it creates lots of concern in Baltic states, in Baltic nations. So UAVs in Ukraine, it is, to my knowledge, not my expertise on the Turkish foreign policy, apart from that one. I mean, it is not the cover of including my research. It is out of my research. Yeah, I mean, it is a process. I mean, yes, UAV production is highly connected to politics in Turkey, ruling party, the connections. But apart from that one, Ukraine has a huge capacity, engine capacity, and we had lots of technical cooperation discussions. And also, last year, I advised a thesis, a postgraduate master's thesis how to organize Turkish foreign military equipment sellings, exports. So it's a big, we are very novice to sell our products, to organize it in accordance with the Turkish foreign policy. On one hand, foreign policy interest. On the other hand, it's a business. So it is a big dilemma. We need to organize that one. But apart from that one, I think for Ukraine war, I think Turkey has done very consistent, Turkish policy, apart from the other discussions, it was very consistent. Turkey first declared it was a war. So that's why Turkey closed Turkish straits to the warships. So it prevented a naval front in Ukraine war. So actually it limited to the land in Ukraine, land and air, mainly land, but also, so I think Turkish foreign policy was quite consistent on the issue. And also for our relations in Russia, it's very complicated. They call it, my fellow scholars who are expert on Russia and Russia-Turkey relations, they call it compartmentalization of relations. Actually, we have very well compartmentalized. As for the Turkey-Israel relations, it is another complicated relations, very long distance, very historical connections with the Israel. Let's be honest, for Turkey, Israel is, let's say, inevitable partner. In the long run. Sometimes it happens, interruptions and so on and so forth. And we have seen that one in the Eastern Mediterranean issue and natural gases. They are so dependent to each other. There are fluctuations. Even the current party, leader of the current party in Turkey, whenever he says something against Israel, actually, if you read the between the lines, you see that he doesn't say anything against Israel or the Israeli people. He says against the leader of Israel. He intentionally echoes the name of the leader of Israel, not the Israeli people, not the Israeli state. Actually, it's something we need to care about, I guess. It is beyond that one. It's my person.
Let me just use the sort of the chair's prerogative.
And it's also vice versa for Israel. He says that against the leader of Turkey, not the Turks. Yeah.
I thought that was a great discussion. Thanks, Abner. I think about the bit about Turkey providing or Turkish companies providing drones to Ukraine. I think that would be a whole separate paper in and of itself, because what I got was that perhaps present a different model of military cooperation, different from the more direct institutional cooperation.
Defense cooperation.
Right. But that involves the private sector to such an incredible degree. So in that sense, I think that represents a totally different stage of Turkey as a military provider, military support provider, which involves the private sector. I think there was somebody online,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, we have a question from Eob Grameko.
Yeah. So Eob is one of our students, and Eob, if you can, you're welcome to ask your question or make your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is simple and straight. Turkey is recently becoming under criticism for its drone diplomacy in Africa, particularly for exacerbating, conflicts in Libya and Ethiopia. And also Turkey is in fierce competition with UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and creating tensions in Africa. And what is your view on these two issues? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's a very good question. Actually, and also it is beyond this presentation. As I told you before, our presentation is limited to the bilateral military relations, including the military to military. As for the UAVs, as I mentioned, last year, I advised a master's thesis how to organize Turkish foreign policy and also Turkish defense procurement defense product selling, industry product selling process. Actually, it is a very complicated issue. Since Turkey is a novice defense industry product seller, exporter, I think Turkey needs to learn the issues. I do know this drone diplomacy in Africa. Two conflict parties are can procure Turkish military products. This is the lesson. These are the lessons Turkey needs to learn and come up with its own policy. It needs to be matured. It needs to be developed. We have discussion in Turkey a lot among the security scholars for organizing that one. That's one of the pitfalls of the defense selling process. We need to learn, I guess.
Yeah, there's been some reporting in, I think, the Washington Post about specifically this issue, I think, especially with respect to the conflict in Sudan. So you've got different parties, the UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, involved in various ways. So there's been some focus on that. I do want to open it up to others. If you can just introduce yourself.
Janet, we know her.
Yeah, I'm Janet Chadevast, NPTS student. My question is a very simple question, but I really was wondering what makes, for the recipients, for the countries that you have bilateral agreements, what is the factor that makes these countries to turn to Turkey instead of like more traditional suppliers?
Through the years, through the decades, if you are in a close relation, that's the nature of the military cooperation, bilateral relations. It is very deep relation. If you are a recipient as a state, if you are a recipient military aid from other nation, you are creating very deep relations from every corner of your society. I mean, it has a huge capacity, and then it creates a dependency, mutual dependency. Later, I mean, common culture first, and second, mutual dependency, and then it moves in that way. So it flourishes in that way, and then it later result in spreading the relations, other fields, including the economy and some other aspects of life. And also, maybe I should raise most of these nations, the bilateral relations are not limited to military, but also other fields. I mean, agricultural support, educational support, so on and so forth. So it also fortifies the relations. So you can establish the mutual common culture, mutual understanding, mutual dependency, and then it moves forward. So by and large, the relations create a capacity, potential to move forward. I don't know whether it. So I always refrain from the simple questions. I don't know whether it explains your point.
Yeah, pretty much, because I didn't know that in the military or defense sectors, the culture also plays a role. Something new that I would probably be interested to look into. But when you look by the territories as well, it seems like, for example, Central Asia and Turkey do have cultural ties. But I've never thought that this could also tie us in the military.
Let me give you a personal experience. I was academic at Turkish Military Academy. So it's pretty much West Point system, converted to the West Point system in 1950s. And there was a student from Turkmenistan. He was officer candidate. And I was teaching on political science and international relations. So we were independent to discussing anything. And one day he criticized Turkey a lot. And just like we are criticizing, And then we have a pedagogical department, pedagogical and guidance department for psychological issues. They are experts on this issue. That's why I said West Point system. And then I applied to them for that specific student. Please talk to that student and then make a psychological analysis if he's complaining from something, if he's not happy for his life here, so on and so forth. And a month later, I received a report from the psychological department, pedagogical and psychological department. They said he felt himself so Turkish citizen, so he's moving the stage of complaining of the current issues. Now he must be colonel now in Turkmenistan. So it creates lots of connection. And I said he moved beyond the desirable point. So it creates. I mean, it's a very tiny example. So it makes them very close to each other. I mean, let me give you an example. Personal. I had many Albanian military students at Turkish Military Academy. Once I needed to go to Albania, Tiran. One of them learned. I was there with my wife. We went there. They took me from the airport, spent 5 days for escorting for anything, although we didn't want anything, and put me back to the airport, took care of us. It's cultural connection, unbelievable. You can imagine how they feel themselves so close to each other. So it is also good for peace building. I mean, if you are very close to each other and in a personal level, at the decision-making level, it might work in a way.
This is reminding me of a conflict transformation fellowship program at the Middlebury College and the Institute. But that was a great question because it sort of looks at it from the other side of the agreements, brings in issues of strategic culture, but also cultural affinities. Other questions? Yeah, Robert, please. Professor Rogowski.
No, Robert's better. You have 147 of these,
Yes.
and when you go in with a framework agreement, do you have a model framework agreement? Are they each individually, are they 147 very different agreements, or is there a model that you follow? And my follow-up to that is, you have more than anyone else, I guess you said. Turkey is leading the way in this. That seems like a huge commitment. Are some of these just on paper and don't really exist? Or are you building an infrastructure, a budgetary and budgeted infrastructure to do this with all of these countries? I mean, how does that work?
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. Actually, there are periods, and every period, every region, you can feel by the time you are reading all these agreements, you feel the evolution of the agreements in a pattern. There are differences, slight differences, but there is a real pattern you can follow. The first ones in early 1990s with the Central Asian states and the Eastern European ones, it is pretty much very framed in a similar way. Most of them quoting to the Partnership for Peace program, NATO program, quoting that one. But after 2000s, they quit that quotation for any NATO partnership program, but they kept the agreements kept its patterns and its content outline of it. But there are slight changes, some individual cases. For example, as far as I remember from Hungary, it was including military history archives. So there are some individual cases for different in different agreements, but pretty much there are outline sharing. The general frameworks of the outlines are different, but also you can seize the form the caravan on the way discourse or formula. So it improved and developed in the way. So there is a pattern. There are lots of similarities. And also it's bureaucratic production. you know, if it happens at the DOD, MOD, the project officer, it gets the similarity from the previous sample, it moves on that way, it reaches to the parliamentary and the commission, they discuss. So the pattern, there's a definite pattern, and I would say 80% coverage are similar to each other for two kinds of agreements. As for the implementation, actually, the first sign is, as I told you, 83 different nations and 147, which makes almost 60 of them has follow-up agreements. If there is a follow-up agreement, which means it developed. If there is not necessarily it ended, it failed. For the Middle Eastern and Gulf states, they are let's say paused because of some political. UAE and Turkey had problems recently and they solved. So like that, there are some pauses, and for maybe 30% of the framework agreements, we didn't need any follow-up agreement. The framework agreement itself including the follow-up agreement rules. So I would say like that. Apart from, I mean, let's check the regions. For Europe, it reached its success. They became the member of multilateral agreement. For Caucasia and Central Asia, it is ongoing and still in close connections. For Africa, there are very good relations, and also there are some promising places. And for the Middle East and Gulf, it is so fluctuating, you know, implementation is so. I would summarize in that way, I guess.
Let me add a word to what Robert said, and which I tend to kind of agree. I know that from episodic experience, that sometimes bureaucrats, the foreign ministry is part of being in a country and being in headquarters. They produce those bureaucratic things, cooperation agreement, and often there is almost no true reality behind it. Israel in the 60s had agreement with many countries in Africa of sending military delegation training. With some of them, there's a sense, some number of officers with a little staff to help to train, to give some programs. With some others, it was something on paper that did not have much beyond its reality. It was, you know, it was kind of the activity. But so I didn't look case by case, but I tend to be a little bit skeptical that behind the 147, the fact that you have 147 agreements, it means that there is a real reality of cooperation, military cooperation with that kind of scope. It just doesn't seem to be right.
You know, no, actually, most of them are active. I just want to have.
What is active? A few officers, an officer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Turkish.
Very small scale.
You know, it's unbelievable. I mean, Turkish military is Prussian tradition. That's the only army in the world, including Germany, keeps the Prussian tradition. So I myself had lots of problems because of Prussian discipline. So if bureaucratically speaking, they keep the, I mean, if it's on the paper, they execute on one hand. But I think this discussion is highly connected, and what you said, what Abe asked to us online, and he asked us the defense diplomacy and procurement diplomacy. I think there is a huge, let's say, trap for Turkey for this promising African military bilateral relations. If we fail in Ethiopia cases like that, bad cases, it would these agreements would be garbage. That's true. And then we can lose our accountability and reliability. I think it's all about the performance. I put on the bright side, I put the Somali case, if Somali would be a role model, that was important. But what Abe raised and also Dr. Cohen highlighted about the pitfalls of the agreements of the future, I think it's all about the performance of the Turkish foreign policy and consistency in the region, especially for Africa. Yeah, that's true.
because there might be some perhaps reputational costs. If there is a perception that some of these agreements, you know,
And there is
are not
also
being-
responsibility.
Right, are not either being operationalized or implemented, or perhaps worse, you know, that if you get embroiled.
You know, when you send one officer to the academy back and forth, the country agreement, it's a military agreement to have to send. But if it's one or two officers being sent to the academy, it's
No, not the one, two officer, that's what Turkey sent lots of uniforms, all these nations. You know, when you see, definitely, you can see, okay, it's gone. Let me give you another funny story.
But you didn't really check what's the full reality of each of these agreements.
Yeah, I didn't study. I put
You did not?
this is the first. No, I didn't. As I told you, for future studies, it could include the performances of each and every agreement. It's necessary.
That'd be the book project.
Yeah,
But I think
that would be booked.
right. I think there's a question online, please.
Jim Lamson, Lamson has a question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to get my video working. Looks like my video will not work, so sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we can see
Okay.
you too.
Oh, you can too. Okay, good. Thanks so much for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I'm an Iran follower, so some of the concepts in the discussions you've been having are very interesting to me. Kind of comparing Turkey's situation with Iran. But as we've looked at Iran and especially its defense and military relations with Russia and China, for example, looking in the past several decades, to the point of regarding the formal cooperation and these framework agreements and follow-on agreements, when we look at Iran, we see a very similar pattern in terms of what we call Channel 1, if you will, where Iran does these very similar framework agreements and follow-on agreements in various defense industrial and military areas with, for example, Russia and China. But we also have two channels, what we call Channel 2 and Channel 3, where, very briefly, Channel 2 is cooperation between lower-level organizations and companies that is not part of a larger framework agreement at the highest levels, but is just it's driven by the organizational needs and interests by the individual companies and organizations, but then is approved by the supplier country's government to go ahead. And then Channel 3 is, at least in how we see Iran, is an illicit procurement. So it's where specific Iranian companies and organizations are procuring things or doing cooperation with individual companies and organizations that are not approved by the supplier company. So we have these three channels, and they all have their, of course, implications for analysis and for collection and all that, and for policy. But do you see, the question is for Turkey, is all of their, whether it's things coming into Turkey or things going out of Turkey, is all this cooperation in this, what we would call Channel 1, where you have this top level framework and follow-on agreements, or is there some stuff going on at those other levels, that's not part of a framework agreement, whether it's officially approved by the supplier country or illicitly conducted, or is it all kind of the channel, what we call Channel 1?
Jim, thank you very much for the question. Actually, Turkey's position is very weird. As I told you, Turkey is very novice defense industry seller. And I am afraid still there is not existing any connection with bilateral military agreements and also defense industry product selling. There are some moves for the last couple of years to improve that one, but still there is no robust and tangible connection between the state bureaucratical system and also enterprises, and to make them connected to each other. Actually, in Turkey, there are some, let's say, state-sponsored companies, defense companies. These state-sponsored defense companies have been selling products in accordance with these agreements. That's the case. But admittedly, the engine of the defense industry is not state-sponsored companies. they are newly technological companies and also new initiatives and also civilian initiatives. Still in Turkey, we are lacking that connection. And also this is my other intention during the promoting my research in Turkey to let them combine our sellers to do this state relations and state brokerage relations. Yeah, I would say this will be a kind of it's weird though. I know from the capitalist understanding, but Turkey did this consistent policy from the security perspective, not the trade perspective. Interestingly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just go back to a couple of questions that I had, or comments. One was on your list of the countries with whom Turkey has military agreements. It was interesting to see Sweden over there.
Yeah.
And especially over the last couple of years, and Sweden getting into NATO. So I wonder, I mean, are those is that kind of a military agreement still being implemented, operationalized, or is it sort of moribund and dormant, especially with Sweden?
I mean, for the European states, which they became already member of NATO, I think this bilateral relations moved to other level, moved up to the other level, multi-level for all for one level. So this is not the case for the Eastern European states and their status. If they became most of them became the member of NATO, it moved beyond that point. So it wasn't necessary so far. Yeah. It is completed.
Right.
It's a kind of completed. For Sweden, it is the case. I don't know whether they now regret to become of the NATO member regarding the increasing the sharing, burden sharing issue.
Good timing, you say?
If Turkey vetoed one more year to them, they would give up the idea of becoming the member of NATO, I would say.
Sure, but I noticed that Engin has joined online.
Yeah, I wanted to recognize Engin, who's a friend of ours, and he was also a student at the institute and a senior Turkish diplomat. So Engin, hi. Wanted to check if you wanted to comment or say something. Hey, good to see you.
Hello, Professor Joshi. Hello, Haldun Bey. I see a lot of familiar faces around the table. Professor Knopf, Professor Khan. Hi, everybody. I just thank you for letting me know about the Zoom streaming. I'm just in Antalya at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum liaising. So I just jumped in for 5 minutes to say hi and see what's going on. So I'm sorry, I don't know what the subject was. So sorry, I just came in right now. So
Where are you? In Ankara or
in Antalya?
There is Antalya Diplomacy Forum nowadays. It's a huge event.
Engin, we'll have to bring you back so that you can give a talk at the institute also one of these days.
That would be an honor and a pleasure.
Wonderful, wonderful. But this was a great talk. I mean, there were a whole bunch of points that I noted. It was interesting that from different conferences that I've gone to and just looking at research by other friends, some have looked at one of the points that you made, which was about the Turkish Airlines and the spread of Turkish Airlines, and especially in Africa, and the sort of the soft power, foreign policy related impact of that, as well as I remember somebody did a conference paper a few years ago on the expansion of Turkish diplomatic missions, consulates, etc., and the impact that has and what it means in terms of Turkey's strategic thinking. So in that sense, I think I would look at these bilateral military agreements as a complement, as part of that broader strategy, whether it's Turkish Airlines or or the consulates being expanded. We're sort of out of time. We're right on 1:45, so I'll have to give you my other comments and questions later. But for now, let's please join me in thanking Haldun for this really stimulating conversation. Thank you, Haldun.
Thank you.
Well,